Welcome to our panel discussion on the real-world impact of generative AI in the past year. Today we will delve together into the significant advancements as well as the challenges that generative AI has faced and businesses with it. To discuss this with me today are my three guests. To my left, Matthias Ziegler, the Global Lead of Technology Incubation at Accenture, Germany. Welcome. Waehner, Field CTO at Confluent, Germany. Welcome as well. And Emmanuel Viale, the Managing Director of Global Innovation Group at Accenture France. Welcome. My name is Frederika Hazeová, and I will be your moderator for this debate. As you can see, or not yet, but we also have Slido, where you can pose your questions during the whole debate, and I will try to address them as well. You can use the hashtag Open6 or just the QR code that you see on the screen. Also, a warm welcome to all of our online viewers who are joining us today. So maybe before we dive deep into the very expert topic of today and generative AI as a technology, I have a question. Imagine that it's year 2035. You come to work, and what's the one task or process that you would like technology to take care of for you so you don't have to leave your energy on it? Which one task or process would you like the technology to take care of? Emmanuel.
Clean my mailbox, number one, very easy. And we still already have that, let's say, in a way. So that's really down to earth for me. And reshuffle the agenda as well in a dynamic way, easy way. So very simple things that we do. We already start to automate, but there you go, very simple.
It's the same for me, actually. Kai.
So for me, it's definitely automating my travel, because it's not just really about booking a hotel or flight, but about optimizing it, and also if things change, to optimize that. And I think this is the tricky part about this automation.
How was it to optimize your trip here?
It was good, but even here, it's always rough these days, right? Because there's always connecting flights and there is delays everywhere. So it's far away from being perfect today, and so I think there's huge opportunity.
Matthias?
Well, 2035, did you say still go to work? I think we should expect more of GenAI.
So what would you expect of that?
Yeah, that actually takes away a lot of the everyday burdens of our work, or makes it even easier for us to do our steps. And later I can share some examples how in preparation for this talk or in supporting some colleagues how we are using it already.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's maybe first look at the personal use of generative AI from your side. How has it impacted your personal workflow, if in any way? And if you could give maybe some specific examples, which one would you like to start? Matthias?
Yeah, well, I can start with a personal example where I was using it. Well, I was moving my second daughter to the Netherlands, where she started studying, and we are helping her to find a student apartment. We got a contract. Okay, it was all in Dutch. So, well, suddenly you want to know what you sign, and so it in the past would have been difficult finding a translator and so on. Now you just upload the PDF and you say, can you translate? And it does it for free within a few minutes and spits out the most important phrases. Yeah? Certainly when you then want to go, it was also summarizing it. So that's the typical behavior. Sometimes AI even overdoes a bit what you ask it, but then I wanted to have every paragraph one by one, so that then required a bit more work. But I see how AI is starting to get better at that too, now with the upcoming of agentic solutions that break down a complex task into subtasks and answers all of those. And so this is getting better. So it was still a lot of manual work to get it exactly doing what I wanted it to do. So that was one example from private life.
Yeah, we still had to also learn how to write correct prompts so it does what we want, right?
Exactly.
Thank you. Kai or Emmanuel?
Yeah, I mean, I have tens of examples already, because really GenAI changed my life. I use ChatGPT every single day privately. It's so good in summarizing things and giving short answers and giving more complex answers by keeping the state. So at least 50% of my questions are not going to Google anymore, but to ChatGPT instead, because it's better, it's more concise, it's more clear. The only thing you need to be aware of, and this is why when I showed it to my mom, she also loves it, but she doesn't understand that large language models hallucinate sometimes. So in Google, you are trained in a way that you know where is my Google link coming from, and you look at that, right? You know already, does it make sense or not? With ChatGPT and similar tools, it's much more risky, so you need to understand that. Yeah. But with that, then, it gets so much value out of that. So that's a little bit the private life, and from a professional life, I again have at least 10 different use cases. The most time-saving one for me is actually, so I also write a lot of blog posts and articles, and I actually, because I have hundreds of blogs already, I trained my own K.AI, which is a little bit of a fun name, right? Because my name is Kai, and K.AI is my personal chatbot, which helps me generating content for me. It's still far away from being perfect, but it can be a starting point and saves me 80% of the time writing new content, and this can be a new blog post, this can be an email response, this can be anything else, and this is how I use it every single day already.
And the good thing, it's not perfect, yeah? Because there's this case of one student who applied at the Technical University of Munich, and he failed. So he tried again, and his result was over the top. And he failed again because they said, that can't be you. We know your previous response, we know this response, that's not you. So it's perfect that for your case, your blog posts are generated by K.AI. They are not perfect, but they are just, we are humans, we are not perfect. They're just like you, they represent your personality. Yeah?
100%.
Well, maybe to finish on this one, personally I do a whole lot of photography as a hobby. And I use Adobe and other tools, to denoise pictures, to replace or remove things, people or whatever, all the way to so that's using the Gen AI and different algorithms, not just by the way, models to learn and understand and so forth. And so that in my I've been doing this a hobby for 20 years, kind of being more efficient and creativity. So in the end, I see it as a tool. Whether what I used to do at pixel level to remove a bird or whatever, to now just highlighting it easily, and I see then at work we have a whole lot of designers and people working on the experience, and you can easily transpose from a tool perspective, but also for that. So there you go for my just personal example.
Thank you. I will add one as well, if I may. I think the most creative way of using Gen AI that I have heard of till now from my friends was when a friend got in a fight with her brother through chat, and she wasn't sure what happened and why did they get into the fight. So she took the whole conversation, she put it into ChatGPT and asked her what were the psychological processes behind this argument and why did it happen. And the explanations were actually very, very interesting for her, and she understood a little bit more why he got angry and what happened there. So very interesting use of ChatGPT, I think. But we are talking today during this discussion about generative AI, but this is not the first time that businesses, organizations are using AI for their work, right? We had predictive AI before this for years, which was really delivering value to businesses as well. So maybe if we could just stop by predictive AI for a second, how do you see the interplay between predictive and generative AI? Are we building on it, or are those like two similar ways going past them?
So I can start with that maybe, because I really work in the AI field for 10 plus years, and I'm not coming from research but really from the real world, where banks deployed for fraud prevention or industrial companies for predictive maintenance. And so predictive AI is what we called in the past typically machine learning, right? So it's not magic, it's really just statistic models trained on historical data. And there were a lot of best practices built around that, how you train that maybe in the cloud, but then how you deploy that with low latency close to the factory. And there's a few enterprise architectures and patterns around that. And now what I also had to learn in the last 12 months is generative AI is very, very different. In generative AI, we use large language models, which we typically don't train by ourselves because it's way too expensive, right? So we use something like ChatGPT or similar. And maybe we are based on that and attach our own domain knowledge on that large language model, right? But it's a very different process, and there is much more investment into different areas about how to build an architecture. But even in a production scenario, you typically have a remote large language model and do remote calls to that. In contrary, in predictive AI, you deploy the model embedded in a device or close to a factory. Very different design patterns, and so this is really my lesson learned here. So they are not interconnected really. They have some very similar principles, but in the end it's two very different things, and they have to be solved with very different learnings in mind.
And it even goes that far that we now have networks of different specialized AIs, and one AI, Gen AI, would just be specialized on understanding the question, doing the conversation, and then deciding what is the best specialized AI model to answer it, or maybe multiple ones for different parts of the question, then putting it back together again. And I think that is where it then starts really getting powerful, that we not try to solve every problem with one very generally trained on the whole data of the internet model, yeah? But one that is specialized on the conversation, and then the specialists for the different technical parts or parts of the question.
Yeah, I think just to add, and you answered it already, I think the smaller language models or specialized models where you have a lower data set, I think to your point, Matthias, to combine these together, orchestrating, where you would have traditional machine learning, predictive, etc., to others. And, that opens ways to combine the best of technologies, not just the two, but the subdomains, right? So now it adds more complex, how you integrate, how you control, etc. But I think it's different tools around the same, of course, what we call AI, but which can be misleading, obviously. But I think definitely spot on what the combination and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe if we get a little more specific, Kai, you mentioned that generative AI is pretty different from what you worked with before. So how did it influence your work, for example, specifically? How did it manifest in what you do?
It's really completely changing our work. So I work for a software company, right? We build data streaming platform in the end, and we deploy this infrastructure in the cloud for our customers on Microsoft, on AWS, on Google, and so on. And in the end, it can simply take away so many of our efforts by automating them. And this is already, which I want to see of the questions already in Slido, which is in the end, what can Gen AI do besides text generation? I mean, text generation is nice to have, and this is typically how companies get started. Not just we as a software vendor, but also our customers. They play around with that, and the first thing you do as a business, you summarize your documentation, your PDFs, your website, so that you can ask questions against that. There's low risk because it's pretty straightforward. And even if it hallucinates 1 in 10 times, it's not that big risk. But the real value then comes when you improve that. So at Confluent, for example, we integrated Gen AI not just being the documentation which you can ask, but you can also take action on that. And one concrete example is that in the cloud, we operate infrastructure for our customers. So many of them have then so-called Kafka clusters, a streaming platform which we operate for them. And in the first step, you can only ask about the documentation. How can I configure my cluster? How can I add brokers? How can I shut it down? How can I add a connector? And you get the text, and then you do what the text tells you. But as a next step, where we are today already, this is now 12 months later, is where we can ask the Gen AI to help us with that. So what's the status about our cluster? So the Gen AI then needs to connect to our other APIs and summarize that and give us a response. And this is the step where many companies are today. And then the last step, or the next step, which is even more powerful, why should I change the cluster if the AI can do it for me, right? So they should also take the action. And this is where the real power of AI and Gen AI is, but it's also the hardest one, because here now you need to make sure that it does not hallucinate, because with that we can kill the infrastructure of our customers.
Yeah. And also to pick up that question that you choose for the besides text generation, don't underestimate the power of text generation, because everything that can be expressed textually, and that includes all kinds of programming languages, that includes all kind of design languages, that describes all kind of languages, how do you control a 3D printer, for example. All of this is textual, and all of that you can then use and train Gen AI to do. And so just one example, at Accenture, we have a lot of architects. I'm also certified as one of our master technology architects, and we have a platform, and there we express architecture diagrams in a textual form. You can just put it in an XML file or in other textual structure. And then you can suddenly ask questions when you have a set of requirements. You can say, well, how would the best architecture for it look like? And it certainly, the first steps, it does it textually. But then out of it, it can create the diagram. And then suddenly, before you needed, well, a senior architect, spending half a day understanding all the requirements, drawing it up, making a proposal, and now very junior persons with the guidance and with the joint knowledge of the firm, certainly in the database, can suddenly create a very proven diagram, and this is also powered by text generation.
Yeah, just to add, and again, going back a bit to my professional, personal experience every day. So, again, so Copilot, but they are, Google and many other platforms are providing the same. So how it analyzes, personally, sorry, maybe I'm old, but I'm lost when, I chat with colleagues over Teams and then I'm shared a document by email or a link and then reconnecting a mail or a meeting we had and a report, Power BI, whatever. So now, using it daily to summarize, generate, provide kind of recommendation, write a summary. So again, very simple. It has proven to be fairly robust and less hallucinative because again, it's close to my area. So that's one example. Another one again, and I've seen either myself at home or some of our coders in the lab, for example. But using it to code generation again. So again, not the big code generation as a whole, right? Where it spits out all the C# whatever code, but being able to debug, get from the enterprise architecture pattern, and then all the way to debugging. Again, fundamentally, when I joined years and years ago, everything was manual, let alone auto code completion. These days, when we develop professionally, you have also all the way down to the stack. Not perfect, but we can project in a few, a couple of years or even today with the debugging, the test generation, etc., etc.
And maybe last thing, while we talk a lot about text generation, and that can also be integrated into APIs, for example, to automate things. Of course, there's many other use cases. In the end, you can generate anything what is digital, right? Like, I mean, if you think about audio, in Hollywood, people are already debating if audio should be legal by Gen AI because a lot of jobs will be lost. But think about a movie you watch in French or in German, and the language, the tone is still the same as the actor because it's generated. Or from a business perspective, and this is already happening in Asia a lot, is where you go to an international conference and it's translated into many languages in real time. Because in Asia there's not just one Chinese, there is 100 flavors of Chinese and they cannot follow each other. So in real time you can generate audio and video and everything. So it's so powerful and the opportunities are really endless.
Thank you. I see a question that is like almost exactly as the one I have here, which is a little suspicious. What is the most unexpected or unconventional use case that has emerged from Gen AI in last year? So we already spoke a little bit of about how you use it, for example, also in Accenture. But was there something that really surprised you or you found really unconventional, maybe also in your business area? Emmanuel, maybe?
No, I think, somewhere, unconventional now, how unconventional and, the exposure in, professional setting, whether it's, with the infrastructure that you run your business on and, you have an unconventional, but that's going to shut down. So I would say, what I saw many times was, humans adopt, again, whether Gen AI or combination as a tool, right? And then it's how the human creativity start to find ways. Now, so I'm not answering directly with the kind of a particular, but what I've seen is kind of unconventional as in making sure now that it doesn't expose the company. So in our, in consulting business, we have, when we work with particular clients, very strict rules of compliance where we operate, where we deliver projects. Of course, not, reusing, copy-pasting from one client to the other. That's very, just for us in values, but also, from a regulatory and standpoint. So I think that's the flip side of it. Training so that our people are not too creative and actually it becomes easier. It might be like, some hallucination. So we need still our lawyers, our contracting team, our experts, whether they are technical architects. So it's more or less the unconventional I've seen and unexpected. Many of those examples with the teams, it's been more to try to moderate in the good sense of the term, not kill the creativity. And I think that's more what has been, at least what I've seen and on my concern, to be honest.
Yeah, and what surprised me in the last year, it's not for one specific use case, but still really how good these large language models are, even the non-paid ones, right? Like the free version of ChatGPT. Because if you try something privately, like when you want to buy the next TV and want to compare 3 different models, you can look at 10 different websites and they're always outdated, right? But if you want to compare a few models, ChatGPT is so good in structuring that the right way. And if it's such a long answer and you tell them, give me the answer in half the text, then it does it to you in a second, right? So that's so powerful, and it's always very concise and decent language in your language. German, for example, is not as good as English, so sometimes it goes back to English, but that works very well. And that what surprised me even more is how it can keep the state and do a correlation for the next question. So if I compare 2 TVs and it gives me a comparison, but then I say, no, I mean this third TV. And you don't need to say more. It's like a human conversation, and it summarizes the comparison of the third TV compared to the others and the pros and cons. And this works so well. It's not enterprise grade again, so this is hallucinating sometimes. For private conversations, it's great. For the enterprise, we need to think about it differently. But this still, we are in early stage. I mean, ChatGPT, I don't know, is a year old, like 1.5 in the mobile app, right? So it's in very good stage already, I think.
Emmanuel, you started a little bit the topic of human AI collaboration of the employees, for example, as well. So maybe how are you guys seeing the dynamics of between AI and human workers in your organizations? And are there specific areas where maybe the AI is augmenting the human roles rather than replacing them, as the fears are usually expressed? Matthias.
Yeah, well, first of all, that certainly is our mantra. Human and machine is even a book our CTO has written, and now the second version of it has come out. So we totally believe that it's not about AI being replacing us and making us obsolete, but that it is about superpowering us with the help of AI. And maybe one particular example I can share is one of the showcases that we have in our Munich Innovation Hub, so my home office, which is about how can we enable engineers to make their tasks much easier than in the past. And there we built first of all, an orchestration engine that's able to choose what type of AI you can freely choose. And then the AI helps you to control 3 different engineering tools. The first one, to modify a design, an existing design. The second is then, that's a very tedious task for engineers, to test the design against certain parameters and regulatories and all the things that they need to keep in mind and sometimes forget, and then it's costly later, so the AI keeps pace of that. And the third is then translating the final result then into a model that can be printed in additive manufacturing on a printer. And that shows how and we start this use case with, okay, you're a new engineer, the old one unfortunately has left the company, but here's the existing design he has left over and you need to finish, and you have no clue. And then we present the people with a large sheet of papers that in fine print, these are all the things that you have to keep in mind. You know all of those, yes, and then suddenly everybody's flabbergasted. And then we see how you're just in a dialogue. You say, well, I have this design of a battery case for a better electric car, but it needs to have 1 more row because the battery needs to be bigger. And then it leads you in a dialogue through the whole process. And this is such a game changer and making you so much more productive, or even enable you to do a task you weren't able to do before.
How long have you been using this?
This showcase we are doing already since a couple of months now. It's still leading edge. And certainly the proof is in the pudding when you need to integrate it with all the different vendors. Yeah? And that's what we're currently working on, that we make it ready for a different vendor so it can interoperate with multiple design tools, because not everybody has the same. And that's where it then becomes more enterprisey, I would say. So that's where then companies need support, understand how it works, how does it fit in their enterprise architecture, and then probably they also start engaging field CTOs to help them on that path. And
Yeah, that's a great example. Kai, did you want to add something or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still always think, as you also said, when we talk about AI, first define what exactly we mean. Like, it's not the next Terminator, right? So that's also one question here about what's the mad and dangerous fear with Skynet and so on. So still, I mentioned it before, but there's a difference between what AI you mean with predictive AI. I mean, when you do a credit card processing in a second, that's what our customers do with data streaming. The model inference happens in real time, it has to, right? But that's very solid. And what's changing over the years now is that these models get better, or you use multiple models because of more compute power and so on. So that's very solid, but that's also not the big risk. So for generative AI, as we discussed with very different architectures, and where we want to communicate more like in a human style with another thing which gives me a response, that's a very different conversation. And this is where I don't see most enterprises being there, because it's way too risky, and you need to do many more validations even after the content is generated before you really decide to process that. And this is, by the way, also now back to the question about Skynet and the fear of the robots and whatever. The basic rule of thumb about compliance, regulation, access control, this doesn't change for AI, because the technology exists today to kill the world, right? Today a human needs to press the button, but a person doesn't have the access control to do that. And in the same way, you need to hinder AI for doing that, no matter because in the end it's an API call. And is it a button click by a human, or is it the Skynet or whatever, right? So this is how you can enforce that something like this will not happen in the future. And I already attended a session today, and there's more about cybersecurity and security in general. And this is the answer to Gen AI in the same way like it is for the human processes in the past.
Yeah, no, I think just to add on the Skynet or first, I mean, AI has no emotion. So unless you want it to mimic and to behave. So again, it's kind of, it's a machine. So we'll see later on when, not going into the mimicking of the brain and etc. to the size compared to what computers can do etc. But I think on this one as well, it was mentioned in some of the discussions earlier, but again, the EU Act or some of the other policies, again, fighting against bias. It didn't come with Gen AI, to look. So it's more, the danger is not to have to piss off an AI or a group of AI. It's more about controlling so that it's not, like you said, hallucinating. It's not biased. Or like in Europe, I think also we could argue, the US, they will do it, and Europe will put law and refrain creativity. I think it's kind of in this case, that's where we are, starting to put rules and guidelines, frameworks, so that companies need to comply to for the benefit of us and users, but also their own systems, to your point, on risking their own business with unproven elements.
So we don't have to be nice to it? Or what's the answer?
Well, maybe one more point on why to be nice to it. I recently tried out one of our own AIs, which is in beta mode, and testing it out if it would really perform on a subject I knew myself very well, so I knew if it was giving the right answers or not. And it was giving only a partial answer, which was not the one expected. So I was trying to nudge it towards saying, towards what I knew was the answer, and I was doing it in a very polite way, and afterwards I was really happy, because as it was in beta mode, it was monitored by real humans that tried to further improve it. So have that in mind too, that in the end, what you say would also show up at a real human, and that for sure you want to be polite to.
Thank you. Another question, which is quite nicely connecting to what we talked about already. What challenges do you see when it comes to the quality or availability of data for predictive AI models? Kai?
Yeah, I can start with that. I mean, that's also what I discussed in the keynote this morning, right? AI is great, and all these tutorials you do in your Python Jupyter notebook when you get started learning this in the university, but you always start with good data quality, right? And this is not the real world. That's very easy, right? It's not the real world. In the real world, data engineers spend 80 or 90% of their time on improving the data quality, and the model training, which is often the most fun in the university, that's not the main part of your daily business typically. And this is exactly the challenge AI has, and both for predictive and for Gen AI, because if you get shitty data in, you get shitty models out, and with that your predictions don't work. And so the fundament of AI is good data quality. And that's in the end the core of our business, where we process data in real time if needed, because with that then you can make sure the data is always accurate. And this is not just for the model training itself, which is a batch process typically, right? But after you have trained a model and you want to do model inference, you need to take the right data in there as an input. And that need to be consistent and up to date. And you can look across industries. If you go to retail and want to do a recommendation for the customer in the store, you need to know what the inventory is so that you can do the right recommendation. If you want to do sales in an airline because a flight changed, you need to know what tickets are available on another flight. And we're not talking about real time in 5 minutes here. We're talking about transactional behavior, because if one flight is rebooked, then 100 people at the same time try to take the next flight. And this happens every day. And if you don't have this consistent data combined with AI, your AI will fail, and then it will create even more trouble afterwards regarding regulated markets, but also regarding customer experience and cost. And this is really why data quality is the foundation of any AI success story.
No, just to quickly to add, I think also using synthetic data, so where you have pools of data and trying to change the data model. So again, that's AI coming to the rescue of AI, meaning through quality and availability. So again, we've worked a whole lot in Accenture on building synthetic data approaches, so that when you have such sometimes not a whole lot of high quality data in some areas, missing, not available, etc. That also helps into going around. So I like this one because, again, it's AI to the rescue of data for AI, which can create a virtuous loop. But again, it has its limits, and always going back to what you want to use it for. And because, again, you can also screw up synthetic data sets easily by not looking at how you want to transform it to whatever purposes. So the other ways that exist, techniques, technologies to look at as well.
Well, this brings us also to real data streaming, and data streaming is fueling really innovations across the variety of industries. In your opinion, which industries are leading the way in adopting real-time data solutions, and how are they using these technologies to gain maybe a competitive edge?
Yeah, so I can start from our perspective, right? We have 5,000 plus customers for data streaming across all industries. Which are the leading industries is a tough question, because it depends on what business problem you want to solve. From a marketing perspective, we love talking about telco infrastructure and gaming. So these two industries, they have super high volume, right? And they have this volume continuously because they have millions of users on their mobile phones or millions of users playing a game. And with that, you continuously create log data. So these customers process gigabytes per second with the streaming platform in real time to do fraud prevention, to do upselling while the player is in the game, not a minute after he left the game, but you want to upsell while he's in the game. So these are in the end the ones where these are the most fancy success stories. And having said that, our largest group of customers is financial services. So they don't have huge volumes, but they, on the other side, have the most critical data sets. And therefore, they more and more onboard data streaming, not just for real-time capabilities. So this is not something new, right? We do real-time with messaging for 20 years. But the fundamental difference is that it gets more and more data-driven, and you need to connect data from different sources. Some are real-time, like the mobile app transaction, but then also combine it with the back-end, which is still a file-based system on the mainframe, for example. And then you connect with an API to your CRM system in the cloud with Salesforce. And so therefore, really to emphasize, the value of data streaming is not just real-time at scale. That's the core of it, of course, and that's how you can easily differentiate to a data lake, where you store the data forever to analyze it in batch. But in addition to that, a challenge every single organization has is data consistency between real-time and non-real-time interfaces. And this is exactly what a streaming platform and an event-driven architecture handles out of the box, so that you can still choose your favorite application, a data lake, a data warehouse, a mobile app, but all these events are accessible in good quality when you need them, no matter if it's real-time or not. And this is why, now that is a long answer, right? But this is now why data streaming is really relevant across all industries, but the use cases and the sweet spots are very different depending on the problem you want to solve.
Emmanuel was first, I think.
No, quickly, I think you answered it well. I think going back to the industries, automotive, industrial, obviously, in the past 10, 15 years went through kind of very, quote-unquote, archaic ways, kind of old-fashioned, all due respect, to digital. And actually now I've seen personally where also they generate a huge amount of data, but it's actually to monitor their production, their supply chain. So, similar to the real-time aspect. And I think how they pivoted to also, collect, use, do sometimes predictive, sometimes not so much Gen AI yet, potentially. I mean, except what Matthias you mentioned in some of the industrial areas, etc., for the worker. But these I've seen now, having a solid basis to optimize their own way, be more sustainable. The application of really lowering the, cost, of course, of supply chain and, building here, getting the car or whatever they're building over there, and that I've been quite impressed with this kind of shift over the past several years.
Matthias, you wanted to add something as well?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. The monitoring of the operations of IT systems, but also beyond of the business, that's the cross-cutting case that actually unites across all the industries. Yeah? And the business application might be different, but their data streaming is applicable across the board.
And maybe also just to emphasize again, so data streaming is not the silver bullet for every problem, right? It's in the end the core of the event-driven architecture, but you connect to any system. And when you mention automotive and, for example, connected car infrastructures, there is not a single connected car infrastructure worldwide which is not based on Kafka, which is the core of data streaming. But for the last mile integration, you always use as purpose-built technology, in this case MQTT, because that's a technology that can connect last mile to millions of cars, even in bad networks. On the other side, if you go to an industrial space, you very often use something like OPC-UA. And when you go across industries and use cases, you have different technologies that you complement data streaming with. And the same way with AI. There is not one AI solution, but the sweet spot is, as everything is just an event, you can connect any new technology into the processes. So our customers that run the streaming platform for many, many years, they didn't think about Gen AI today. But because they have everything separated and decoupled, now you can just slightly change the business process and connect to a new Gen AI technology. Whatever that is, it's a cloud service, it's an implementation you do, you have this freedom of choice. And I think this is this change in mind today. It's not tight coupling and point-to-point anymore, but you get data in from anywhere once, and then you don't know tomorrow who will consume the data and what technology. And this is this freedom of choice, which you don't really have. You have tight coupling point-to-point, and this is really where data streaming helps a lot with building these AI architectures.
Matthias?
May I ask a quick question into the audience that we see here? Maybe a raise of hands who has a technical background here?
Almost everyone.
So, okay, good. Because then we can tailor our answers. So, because I noticed some of our answers are getting quite technical, but so I wanted to make sure we're not losing anybody, but I think it's for this audience, it's okay.
Yeah, good
Thanks.
point.
Yeah. We are getting close to our coffee break, but maybe we have 2 last minutes. Emmanuel, you mentioned the automotive industry. So is that the industry, in your point of view, that is like lagging behind a little bit, this train, or is there any industry that should get quicker in adapting to these new trends?
No, I mean, some, obviously you could say quicker is a natural move, but it goes back to some of the point of data availability, what they are trying to solve. Your example of Deutsche Bahn this morning was, I mean, SNCF is the same in France, to be between us, so the trains. But, so I think I don't see any major industries lagging behind. What I think the next play will be, I think it was one of the talk tracks about the interoperability, the sharing of the data, shared, not shared, whether it's model, data, confidential computing, which is also a complementary element. So I think less about some laggards than it is about the transformation of industries into what type of service and how they want to rotate themselves. I think you mentioned some of the native players, financial services, I mean, historically has been a data-driven. Less or not, I would, 30,000, transactions a second for Visa, etc. That's huge volumes. Now they apply, like you said. So I think, no, not to summarize laggards necessarily. I think it always comes back to the points we covered. When it comes to Gen AI then, and applying and trying to see, it's where actually Gen AI as a tool, whether, it was combined with predictive and everything, was helping move towards more automation, of, again, consolidating transactions that were done manually, pseudo-manually, or old-fashioned ways and processes, to send a fax to clear custom for shipment. That's kind of RPA, what we used to call RPA several years ago. Now you add additional Gen AI element, and it's still the same quote-unquote story. So that's where I've seen the changes and where some. And the next mile will be for the next decade, going back to your 2035 question, the kind of how vast industries or parts of industries will also change, merge, adapt with the kind of data services that will AI or others will help them transform to.
Thank you, Kai.
So just to add to that, so from my experience, and I work with customers around the world across industries, don't make the failure, just take a look at your industry, right? It's really more about what business pain and problem do you want to solve. Like, if you want to make a better customer experience, you should take a look at retailer, even if you're a bank or a telco, because they have solved this problem already. You can learn from them, right? You have different business objects and sometimes different compliance challenges, but that's in the end how I would really look at it. It's more about the use case level. Because on another example, like one of the slowest innovators typically is the public sector and government, right? Like in Germany, we still use fax, right? And we even did a new order for new fax in the government. But on the other side, if you think more about other topics like military, I mean, there's much more budget investment. So it's really more about what use case do you want to solve and not so much which industry you're in.
Thank you so much. We will now have a 10-minute coffee break. We will meet back here at 1:50. So see you in a while.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I'm glad to see all your faces again here. If we have somebody new with us, welcome to our panel discussion about generative AI. Here with me today are Matthias Ziegler, the Global Lead of Technology Incubation at Accenture Germany, Kai Waehner, the Field CTO at Confluent Germany, and Emmanuel Viale, the Managing Director of Global Innovation Group at Accenture France. We are talking about generative AI, and I will start immediately with your questions. We have one here that might be an urban legend. We talked about it a little bit with Emmanuel. A while back, Facebook had to shut down 2 of its machines because they started communicating between each other in an unknown language. Do you think this is something which will happen more as AI evolves?
So, so this one I read a few years ago and tried to follow up. So maybe, I see Christian, my friend from Sophie Antipolis here. Maybe you can copy-paste this in ChatGPT and we will get an answer. But joke aside, so here I think when I read at the time was more, let's say, a feedback loop between 2 systems and with just garbage. I don't see it was a plot against humanity that these two... But again, I think in the control and also the way systems evolve, that's going to be interesting to look at in the future. So I think more for me an urban legend than anything else. But again, I may be wrong.
We were talking about the legislation as well a little bit in the first part of the debate, and we have a question that is connected to that, and that is, what do you think of the EU AI Act, especially in regard to European startups versus competition from the big players like OpenAI, Google, etc.? Who would like to answer? Kai?
Yeah, so I see huge challenges, honestly. I work a lot with large organizations that operate globally, and I also work with a few startups, both in Europe but also in Asia and the US. And on both perspectives, first, the large perspective for large organizations, if you take a look at Apple and Meta and so on, they do a lot of innovation around AI. Sometimes the question is it good or not, right? But the reality is many of these features are not coming to Europe for these kind of regulations. So the large organizations don't take the risk, but something like the new Apple iPhone features, they are not available in Europe. And it's even more extreme than here what you read in the press, but I travel a lot to the US, and I have a separate iPhone for the US with the US software on it. And this is not for the fancy Google services, but Starbucks, for example, has its own app in the European App Store because what they're providing in the US, in some cases, it's not compliant to European law. So I want to order my coffee in a Starbucks in the US via the mobile app and pay for that because it saves me 15 to 20 minutes every time I order a coffee there. And this shows it's not just for the Google and Meta, but it's really a problem for every large organization. And in a similar way for the startups, I mean, there will not be the next TikTok from Europe, right? Because we are not allowed to build this. And the consequence then is everybody's using TikTok from mainland China and everybody is using Facebook from the US. And I see huge challenges here also when I talk to our customers from Europe because they hear all these stories. I tell them what our customers do in Asia and the US. But they cannot build it. It's that easy, right? Because they need to be compliant to law. And I see this is a huge blocker for Europe. It also has pros, right? It's not like all of that is bad, like data privacy. But I think they're limiting factors, so it's much too strict in my opinion.
And maybe to also add a bit of a different perspective is, Europe was also on the forefront for the GDPR, so for data privacy and data protection. And certainly we all, to one end, suffer because it's regulation, you have to apply it and so on. But in the meantime, this has been adopted by all companies that want to operate globally. They say, okay, well, this is the strictest regulation, let's comply to that, and then we apply it somewhere else as well. And I think that was a good chance from a European perspective to hold human rights and also human privacy rights high. And I think the world, even to one end, it's suffering from it, but at the other end, it's also benefiting from it, because the risk is that the power that is currently with a few very big tech groups just needs a bit of a counterbalance.
Emmanuel?
No, quickly, I think everything almost has been said, but yeah, like you said, we've seen these waves of, the US will do it and Europe will legalize it or unlegalize or put structures. I don't think they are necessarily, it's too philosophical approach. I don't want to be philosophical here, but it's kind of different approaches. In the end, what we've seen is kind of whether, some accelerated, there was some economic advantage, or depending on, in Europe, in the end, were we right, I think, with GDPR and so forth, whether it was for the good of the end users or, blocking innovation, personally, I think we were right. Now it's about the timing, competitiveness. I think also what balance, so we've seen this story again, you mentioned GDPR, I think also with cloud, sovereign cloud, for just sovereign elements, nationwide, cross Europe and beyond, has been around for years as well. Now, was it blocking innovation or just going innovation too fast and not good and going back, or going maybe at a slower pace? So personally, I'm more, European in that mindset, and I'm European, by the way, so, and I see this more, and we are seeing this again, and time will tell, but I think we are on the same pattern again.
And just to conclude that, I work a lot with the automotive companies. We talked about that before the break, right? The global car makers, they have 3 deployments. It's that easy, right? They have one for Europe, they have one for the US, and they have one for mainland China. And there's no way around that. And I don't see how this changes anytime soon.
You mentioned GDPR, or the protection of personal data. What are maybe some other major ethical issues connected with generative AI that we should take into perspective, or that we have to tackle as a society?
Well, I think we talked a bit earlier, but again, the bias will come again. Back to your quality of data or biased data by nature, regardless, we regenerate it, we control. So I think that's inherent to the overall approach. In any case, afterwards, it's about the exposure. It's about, again, when we talked about hallucination. So is it, are you putting in danger your business because you think that you comply with all these many French rules and whatever rules, and you get a direction, and you don't spend time as a human to read. So this again, it's not just for Gen AI. So it's again the control. I mentioned some techniques coming up earlier in one of the presentation. It's about going with again a boom of one new element adding to AI, Gen AI. And afterwards, lots of promises, and it's a miracle, it's magic. And actually, no, it's not. It's imperfect, and the imperfection is what makes the big difference here.
Yep. And one more is the transparency. Something we are also working on, how to make it explainable, so on the keyword explainable AI, so that it's not a black box and you don't know why did one person get the credit and another one did not get it, or other important life decisions that should not be taken without anybody knowing how and why.
And then maybe in addition to these problems like bias or being transparent, there is the common questions like, when should I use AI, right? Today AI is used much more by fraudsters than by other people, right? When you want to do fraudulent behavior, like in a chatbot, social networking, payments, that's really where Gen AI helps all the fraudsters, because they can generate 100x more content easily to do fraud. And even one level higher, we talk about automotive all the time, so one thing I follow a lot is the autonomous cars scenarios. And one very simple question, which is super hard to answer from an ethical perspective, is if you have a level 5 self-driving car that sees you in the car, and then you have 10 kids in front of you, and you have a decision to make. Should I brake or not? I cannot do anything else. I braked and I go down the bridge and I die, right? Or should the 10 people die in front of me? It's a really hard ethical question with not, what's the answer to that, right? I mean, if I'm in a car, I don't want to die, even if 10 kids are in front of me. So these are questions which are super hard to solve from an ethical perspective, and I don't know the answer to that.
These are the classical ethical dilemmas, but one thing you brought up I want to emphasize, that is the questions, what should AI do? And it's not what can AI do? I think currently, and that's also how the tech companies are driving it, is, what can AI do? And then it will come, because the regulation is never catching up. I think that is the discussion we should have across the globe, by government bodies, by universities, by us as educated influencers in large companies, to say, what is actually the things that we as humans believe we should do ourselves? We should care ourselves maybe for our parents and not give it to a conversational bot that keeps them happy when they are bored at home, when they are elderly. Yeah? So those questions we should answer first, and then focus the use of AI on then what is remaining, how we often say, the dull and boring and dangerous areas that maybe are less human to do, and see how we automate those, and not at the moment the most interesting. I think one of the influencers once in the internet answered it in a way, I was hoping AI was organizing my day and making me free to be more creative and do this creative work, and now AI is doing creative work and I do still the dull and boring things. So I think we should turn that around.
One more area that maybe wasn't mentioned is sustainability and climate crisis. 2 years ago, we had a debate also here with your colleagues from Accenture about the role of also technology in sustainability. So how do you see the role of generative AI, for example, in this topic? Part of the problem, part of the solution, kind of both? Emmanuel?
Well, I think one is sustainable AI and AI for sustainability. So one is indeed obvious on applications, complex problems. This morning I mentioned the Nobel Prize and using AI to solve, complex problems. So same for, how you optimize the shipping across the world, how you, all these largely complex optimization problems. So that's a whole lot of areas we're using. Well, AI, by the way, traditional statistical approach, Monte Carlo, all the way to maybe Gen AI in different cases. I think the flip side is, we work a whole lot with NVIDIA, for example, and you see the consumption of the hardware to train, to analyze, to store, to stream, etc. So, and from just a few years ago, we're still in a Moore's law example, if that still exists, or something where the cost goes down, but now it's also the energy efficiency of the chipset and the hardware. So we're working a whole lot on the high-performance computing, next-gen computing elements. And again, NVIDIA is just one example, but that's also the one where I've seen myself. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe my perspective is that from our customer base, we see many of our customers focusing on sustainability when they do things. Like if you think about the industrial space with wind energy, for example, or detecting leaks in water pipelines, right? This is things where if you continuously monitor that and put AI on that, like also something like image recognition, if there is a leak, right? If you can detect this, the earlier, the better. And then you can close the leak, and with that, in the end, you improve the sustainability. And we have many of our customers that are also, especially, and this is where Europe is much, much better than many other regions, where you're focused on improving the sustainability by leveraging AI. So I think we have a lot of good success stories. And on the other side, now we hear where the Googles and Facebooks, they build more and more data centers, which cost energy, of course. This is the tricky part in the end, where over time, I think it will go more and more to green energy and solving this problem, like with wind and solar energy. And I think this is where it's going anyway. So if you tell someone don't use AI because it needs too much energy, that's not going to happen, right? So we need to focus on improving the business processes and using green energy. And this will, I think, solve the problem of being sustainable then.
Kai, you mentioned the fraud activities and how AI is challenging them. I saw a question before in Slido that was tackling the question of fraud. Can we maybe pick it up? If you will find it.
I also saw it, so I think it was more about there it is. You've mentioned use cases in fraud management. What is the best use of Gen AI you've seen? Was it really implemented? And so my answer to that is, I think no. As I said earlier, for fraud, the fraudsters use Gen AI, right? So this is really generating more fraud. On the fraud prevention or fraud detection side, this is really where predictive AI, so the traditional machine learning we use for 10 plus years, this is in the end what improving these processes. So I don't see today how Gen AI can help with fraud management or something. It's really more about, of course, you can automate things, right, with Gen AI, but here I see more the predictive AI, which is really so helpful and getting better and better, also at scale and more real time than just batch, to detect fraud before it happens.
Yeah, I think also initially our cybersecurity lab worked not on, well, fraud management as in, a complex scheme of frauds, right, for credit card, for payments, for whatever, but simply on looking at novel ways, for fakes, impersonating. So, for example, our CEO got impersonated by voice saying, calling an executive in the company, make a payment. Now, something was off. First, it never would happen. And second, so I think the kind of flipping around to see the potential danger. So here it's a pure cybersecurity ID, ID fraud, identity fraud. And some other examples, of course, tapping into through APIs, LinkedIn and others, and recreating a fake Emmanuel that with his post, with his experience, could contact, Christian, again, my friend here, and impersonate me to make things that he would want to do, for example. So that's another example of preventive, let's say, rather than just indeed the bigger, more stable, yet very sophisticated fraud management we've seen for years indeed.
To add one thing that was also mentioned before for another use case is where we see in research or at some of our customers in the research labs about fraud management is really more about synthetic data. So synthetic data where you generate data, because in the end, what you want to do with predictive AI is find anomalies, right? So there is something happening. So typically, you should detect ransomware before it's installed on each computer, because there is some misbehavior somewhere in an anomaly. And to detect that beforehand, you can also generate new content of logs or whatever to simulate that. So this is in the end where I still see more research, but this is in the end then also where generative AI might help to detect fraud before it happened in the end.
Yeah, Emmanuel, you want to add something, or?
No, that's good for this one, yeah.
We talked a little bit about the public sector before, that maybe it's between the sectors that are a little bit more slow in this area. But how do you see the governments or international bodies playing their role? Are they playing it well in regulating AI technologies, or to ensure the ethical development and deployment, since we are already talking about the ethical issues?
Yeah, well, in France, we start, we have, of course, part of EU, so EU Act, of course, so we won't repeat this. I think afterwards it's how, it's making its way, for example, for students, and making sure it's well safeguarded, and, shifting the old-fashioned way of, teaching to students and pupils to novel way, and so therefore different ways and more adaptive. All the way, I think, so using it, for fraud, but like tax fraud, for example, that's something in France we're very good at in a way, and not tax fraud, but preventing and just making clear. But I think, definitely afterwards it's going back to the way, and again, in France, what I know, we've had this wave of AI several years ago, how to structure, accelerate the innovation. The government was here to structure. Then it was also with Quantum, for example, the flagship Quantum project, where we unify national efforts across EU to actually, have our investments, coordinate efforts, research, and creation of startups, etc. So I think here, again, another pattern I've seen in the past recent years for whether it was AI, plain AI, machine learning, etc. a few years ago, all the way to quantum, and I see it playing the same way. Afterwards, will there be more regional rules, etc.? We'll see, but there are enough already.
Okay, let's go through the questions, because we are really many of them, so we have enough time for them. Do you have a suggestion on a good online course for prompting for general AI, e.g. ChatGPT?
Ask ChatGPT.
That's one option, right? Ask ChatGPT. That's a great point, actually. On the other side, what I recommend also is really separate again. Is it more like for personal use, or is it for super critical enterprise systems, right? Because for my personal use, my recommendation is just use it because it learns from you and it keeps the state in there. And if you use a paid service for $10 instead of using the free version, it doesn't tell you after 10 questions, okay, now it's enough, you need to start from scratch again because the state is too expensive. And if you pay $10, then you get state over time. And so you train in the end your own model to give you the right responses which you're interested in. Because for many words or sentences, it's not clear what you mean. But if it already has the state about you, it knows. So my recommendation is really playing around and learning how it works. And with that also you learn the system behind it and how it behaves. On the enterprise side, it's so much more critical and hard to do prompting, because the hard thing is not these 10 prompts where you get a response that you want to see. And again, back to the example of our software, which we provision for our customers in the cloud, where we started by summarizing documentation, super easy. But then as a second part, when you can ask questions about your clusters, about the monitoring, about taking actions like scaling up or down, this is already much more critical. And the challenge is not these 10 actions where you do 10 prompts that works, but the challenge is the 1,000 others where you're not sure if they work. And so I can just tell you from our internal engineering, creating that summary of the documentation to create a chatbot, that's one person who can develop that and roll it out in a week or whatever. But creating a chatbot that allows you to interact with your internal systems and take action, that's a team of 10, 20 people that works on it all year long to make that right. And this is the big difference about how do you do prompting and what do you want to do with that. Because in the end, it's super hard software engineering, and it's much more than just asking the large language model for prompt. It's really the much harder question is how do you integrate that into the rest of your enterprise architecture and compliance and processes.
Matthias?
Yeah, maybe a simple answer also to learning about prompting. In last year's OpenSlava, one of our colleagues gave a 1-hour talk about what were the best prompts that worked well for him. And I believe it's still on YouTube. You find it on the openslava.sk page. And the one thing I remember he recommended, and it was astonishingly really working, was when he added a phrase of, please take a deep breath and think about it step by step. The answers were much better.
That's very interesting. Connecting to the personal use is also a topic that Kai has mentioned a few times, that is hallucinations. So I would pick that question. How much can we rely on AI since it's still prone to hallucinations? And do you know about any research tools or techniques that would reduce or detect hallucinations?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not from research, but really how our customers do in the real world. And the reality is you cannot trust the Gen AI models, right? So what our customers that are early and go to production with that, the thing what almost everyone does is post-validation, which means in the end, you ask the large language model with all the input data you have, but before you send this response out to a customer, or before you even do a transaction like a booking or a payment, you validate what the system generated for you. Does this make sense? And this validation typically means another request into your database to double check it. So this is the best practice, and this is the tool or practical thing that we see how people take the risk, because otherwise the risk is way too high to bring a system with large language models into a transactional production scenario.
And you can even ask ChatGPT itself. I once recall there was one accident happening in Mallorca with some famous people, but the serious newspaper I was reading was not writing who it was. They were too politically correct for that. But I was curious and wanted to know. So I said, let's try ChatGPT. So I said, well, who was that? I described the whole scenario, what I could read from this other article, and said, who was that? And within seconds, I got a response. Yeah, it was the millionaire sowieso, and his son sowieso having this. And I said, wow, I'm really impressed. But then I thought, well, is it true? So I cross-checked it, and I couldn't find those people. And I said, well, I couldn't find those people. So I asked again ChatGPT, are you really sure? So sometimes it helps just to say, are you really sure? Or say, this is wrong, and comes up with the next answer. So it came up with the next answer with some other persons, which were not existing either. And then I said, this is totally wrong. Please don't hallucinate. Just tell me if you know it. And then suddenly it answered, well, I was just making it up. I can't find this. I said, what not? Okay, then I was turning to build.de, and there was it. So...
Okay, Emmanuel?
No, quickly to close on this one, I think first there are different techniques, know about any research tools, techniques to reduce. I think So again, RAG, I mentioned this morning, it's more still in the kind of lab element, but making its way. So again, the tooling themselves, the platforms are evolving to add much more quality and so forth. The other one, but again, if you look at, again, I'm old and most of you were not born, but when we moved from, the old-fashioned way to web 20 years ago, we had enterprise running systems in parallel before they would disconnect, gain the trust, the benefits, etc. Here, now it's more compressed in time. You want to gain competitive advantage. So you want to be the first one. But I think also the change management piece is equally important to run the old system, not so old sometimes, or combine, like you said, Kai, with the AI, good old-fashioned way, which is still fairly recent, machine learning, etc., to more analytical model, and combine. So not answering directly, but I think in terms of the change, not to avoid hallucinations, but to correct. All systems were put in place were not perfect from the get-go. Websites, etc. You haven't practiced Amazon 20 years ago. It was not what it is today. So that's the natural cycles of maturity and adoption, very important.
Yep. And there's also to answer very concretely with one particular tool that I just learned about recently. Some of you might already know it. That is trying to solve this hallucination problem as well. It's called perplexity.ai. Maybe hands up who already uses it or knows it. Nobody yet, so please, a few. So please try it out because it answers you in a way that it, behind each of its statements, it adds the citations of where it found this information so you can cross-check. And that's usually what I always try or put into my prompt, that I say, please also provide me the references, because then I would like to dig deeper if it's really interesting. And it even has a pro mode. If you switch on pro mode, you get 5 questions, complex questions. Then you can even ask very complex questions or a whole paragraph of correlated topic. And then we'll break that down in an agentic solution into multiple steps and then give you a combined answer all together with the references. So that's a way also to address the hallucination problem.
Thank you. Another question is, what should media focus more on when covering on Gen AI, and what do you miss most in the current coverage? Emmanuel.
No, I think this one is demystification. What it is, what it's not, what it's good at. I think this is, we've seen with waves of technologies. I mean, again, I remember introduction of RFID for traceability in the early 2000s was kind of, we'll be tracked, it will be under our skin and will be, no, actually it's solving a problem of traceability and avoiding fraud and others. Same, mobile phones or Google search, it was called, I think in Times Magazine in the mid-90s as is Google evil or something. Now this is again the entry point, if not ChatGPT or others, that we use every day. So I think it's, and again, recently blockchain, Bitcoin, crypto, etc. What it is, what it's not. So the demystification is very important, not just for the technologists and the practitioners that are learning or have practiced and are practicing, but I think in the general media, getting around this, urban legend, as we call them, or real threats that are not the obvious ones that we may think of.
We can really see the history just repeating itself. What are the main advantages and challenges of embedding generative AI into hardware? Kai.
Yeah, I mean, the main difference, we discussed this before, is that generative AI, we talk about large language model, and as the name says, it's large, right? And typically most companies don't train it by themselves, so you have it somewhere else and do a request to that. So this is the fundamental difference about the best practices of deploying and connecting to large language models. And having said that, if you can shrink it a little bit, and maybe a little bit more, but that's the same approach that we have seen for predictive AI, you could have a super powerful model in the cloud, but that's not what you can deploy in a car or somewhere else. And with that then, the best practices are very similar to predictive AI or even just to normal business logic when you deploy it outside the cloud. So most of our customers have a cloud-first strategy that says, if possible, we deploy to the cloud, we don't need to operate infrastructure or hardware, we just use it and solve on business problems. However, there's 3 reasons why I see our customers deploying not in the cloud. Number 1 is cost. Data transfer is super expensive very often. Number 2 is latency. If you need fast responses, like for condition monitoring of a machine, total nonsense to send all the data to the cloud. So it's cost, it's latency, and third, it's about security, right? Sometimes we need to deploy in an air-gapped environment. And with these 3 reasons in the end, you need to shrink the model, but with that, then you can deploy at the edge if you want to or have to, right? Yeah.
No, just to add again, what is large today will be small tomorrow. So, and tomorrow again, is it the 2035 introductory questions? 10 years ago, our phones were, well, making phone calls, doing stuff. Now, it's much more computing power than the NASA in the early 80s, maybe. So, I mean, not fast forwarding, etc. But I think again, here it's what we're talking about. Is it a domain-specific, smaller language model or multimodal models, which is still very large or not so much multimodal, but which can be embedded? And today's, of course, with the approach of large language models and everything we've said, it's not possible as it is. But again, we'll see in the coming years.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthias.
Yeah, so the challenges of embedding it in hardware is the pace of change that we are currently seeing, because once it's in hardware, it's fixed, but you need to have it updatable. Yeah, so I would rather go the middle ground, having a still more general purpose hardware or a specialized solver for LLM operations, but then you can deploy it as part of the operating system, so that would be an intermediate way to accommodate for both the advantages and challenges from both ends.
And I think this is anyway why the trend is going, as you said, in the end to something like virtualized hardware, right? So if you go to the manufacturing space, in the meantime, they produce virtual PLCs, which in the end means you have an industrial PC with Linux and you can install anything and update that. And this is not just in manufacturing, but this is also in telco, where you don't buy proprietary hardware anymore, where the software is fixed on that, but in the end you buy Linux PCs or anything else, and then you can install and update and change things. I think this is the common trend across industries, and this is back to the general question about how hard it is to embed generative AI into hardware. It's not hard anymore because for these reasons, it's much more generalized to open standards like Linux and so on, so that you can do it in a much easier way because you don't know what's coming tomorrow, but you need to be flexible in today's data-driven world.
Thank you. Next in line is a very interesting philosophical question in a way. What do you think, should Gen AI be allowed to train itself in an autonomous manner and eventually write its own code to remove bias when trained by humans?
Again, very nice. In the real world, will it just generate garbage or just for a use case which is that small? Currently, I'm thinking, well, a bit of both, but not the perfect feedback loop, self-autonomous or becoming autonomous and Skynet type of things yet. We'll see in 10 years, but for now...
Yeah, so human in the loop definitely would be helpful, yeah. And the key question, I think it was it half a year or a couple months ago, where also it was in the press that Gen AI is getting dumber and dumber because it's reading more and more of its own generated content on the internet to be better trained. So it's kind of declining or flatlining, while it in beginning it learned from the humans. Yeah? And so that's also a key problem with this self-generated content, if it just deteriorates quality.
But again, using them individually as tools to, again, better data set, enrich data set, looking at particular criteria, again, the bias, whether it's the typical gender, whatever, and feeding to another, but then self-coordinating by a master Gen AI or AI for that matter, all this, well, why not? But I don't see it.
Okay. When do you expect the return on investment into Gen AI will happen? When is the most probable model to monetize it? Subscriptions or paid ads or some other way? Kai?
I think it doesn't matter if you have subscriptions or paid something, right? The point is about what's the use case and the business value behind it. What problem are you solving? So you don't train a model just for training the model, but you train it to solve a problem. And so in the end, it's always from the executive level, you increase revenue, you reduce cost, reduce risk, and the model is a piece of that. It's the same like for us, we do data streaming, right? We are part of the data infrastructure. Yes, we can reduce sometimes the cost by replacing 1,000 MQ brokers by 3 streaming clusters, but that's still just a technical infrastructure for a business problem. And so I always say to customers, lead with a business problem or challenge you want to solve. And then how do you solve it with Gen AI? Well, do you rent a model or do you subscribe to an external model? Do you train your own model? Whatever that means, then that depends on what problem you solve and how much expertise you have versus outsourcing that.
Yeah, and I think the question shows it's a very consumeristic question. So it comes from the consumer perspective of AI. And certainly there, subscription paid ads are the usual ways. And you shall never forget, if it's for free, you are the price. So that's how it is with the previous solution, how it will be with Gen AI too. So you rather be careful there. Certainly we, and that's also the customers that we serve, we believe the return of investment certainly will be much stronger in the industrial applications, and here Kai already described it very well, how that will be focused on a certain problem and that you solve, and then the equation is easy.
Yeah. And I think some of the ROI already happened with, again, the cost reduction you mentioned. So this morning I had this example of Cisco with several thousands of man hours saved per year. Now there was a cost reduction, so it's already a return on investment. Now afterwards also brings the question, which I think we'll use in another answer there, around the talent transformation, how it changes the type of jobs, how it brings more efficiency, speed to market, whatever you want to call it. But those have not very fancy. It's not like magic, etc. It's good old use cases that where maybe AI, machine learning, statistical model proved to be a limiting factor, and again, GenAI as a tool adds a bit more to it. So that's an example.
We are slowly running out of time, but to address this topic that we haven't spent much time of, and it is the change management while embedding GenAI into different systems of your clients. If we could tell a little bit about that, what are your experiences in this area? Matthias.
Yeah, well, I can share one example that two colleagues shared with me when I was prepping for, I was asking them about their experience. They're working in the engineering space, and they said initially engineers, so mechanical engineers and so on, they were really reluctant to pick it up, even if it would have required just an hour to learn how to use it. And so their way was to make it really embedded in the process and make it really easy to access. So that was for the key change enabler. That suddenly then the engineers saw the value, or it was such an easy entry hurdle for them that they started using it.
No, sorry, again, the pattern of demystifying it, getting it into the end users for the use cases so that you can learn from, well, first demystify and not having them scared. So again, go back always for, as a matter of fact, for any new booming technology, it's about putting in the end of the end user and the change management that goes with it. So it brings many, many other questions. Afterwards, it's also, brings toward the, how you capture whatever the business process is that person was carrying out, and help with the change, with capturing the true element, what the benefits are, and so forth. So that's the number one pattern for me, definitely.
Kai?
Yeah, I saw the adoption on two levels, on the software engineering level and also on the business process level. On the software engineering level, you can generate code, right? But if you already have the right policies in place, even if you generate code instead of writing by yourself, if it generates wrong code, it will break the system. So if you have a DevOps pipeline, it will break if it's wrong code. So that's already, if you have good quality assurance in place and unit tests and whatever, then this is just another kind of code creation. Instead of having a junior developer and a senior developer, then you have a third kind of developer, right? So, and this is how we see this being adopted in software engineering in the right way. And the same on the business process level. Like I talked about this in the keynote this morning with Expedia, where in the end, they had a lot of humans that had to respond in COVID to people that canceled flights and refunds, always the same thing. And so they trained a domain-specific language model that did the same thing. But because the entire business process was built the right way beforehand, with data contracts, with policies, with data governance, they could easily slightly change the business process, and first with 8B testing, just hand over 5% of the new requests into the chatbot to make a decision, and 95% to the human, and then change this more and more. So the change management was slow, but because of the right data quality and assurance in place, there was no problem with that, right? And again, as we discussed earlier, for the super critical transactional use cases, you should sometimes do some post-validation. That's then the change versus a human where you trust him. For the Gen AI, you need post-validation. But that's these kind of patterns I have seen in the last few years, and they were adopted very successfully.
Very quick round. What's the one thing we should leave this debate with? What's the one thing you would like our audience to remember or to think about?
It's not magic, it's happening, and will be good.
Thank
you. For me, obviously, it's really think about data engineering and AI. It needs the right context, and that context typically is now and not later. Because depending on the use case, even a second later, it's too late for doing a flight booking or another decision where a large language model can help you. And this is why really the right context at the right time is super important, especially for transactional data, if you want to add AI there.
Matthias?
don't fear. The future is what you will make about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to our audience for being here today.